Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast hosted by Eric Rostad. Join him on his 15-year journey through the immortal books. He'll share what he's learning, explore profound ideas across time and cultures, and share the one thing he always hopes to remember from each immortal book.
Today I'm going to cover Sophist, a dialogue by Plato. Plato is author 18 out of 200 on my Immortal Books reading list. Well, this is my 7th Plato dialogue. I've now read 9, but this was number 7 in the order in which I read them. And I've hesitated podcasting about this one because it was really hard for me. I ended up reading it 3 times using 3 different translations. I read a bunch of articles about it. I asked questions on X, and I talked to Dr. Jason Staples on the phone quite a bit about this dialogue as well. So I'm trying to read through the Immortal Books by 200 authors in 15 years. So spending a few weeks on one dialogue of Plato does not exactly move that project forward. But I really just had a strong sense that I needed to understand this one. I needed to spend the time to think it through, to really understand the argument and to figure out what was going on. And so I really hope that it was worth it, and I hope it comes across in this episode. So really quickly, maybe like a 30-second, 1-minute overview of what is going on here. Here's what the goal of this dialogue is. The goal is to define the Sophist. And what we come across right away is we hit this snag, and the snag is from a philosopher named Parmenides. And Parmenides has said that you cannot discuss things that don't exist. So you've got being on one side, so things that exist. It's easy. We know we can discuss those. We can discuss those things, but non-being, you can't discuss it. It's impossible to discuss something that does not exist. And so the Sophist is known to teach both sides of an argument. So if something that does not exist, like a false statement, if that is impossible, how can we talk about the Sophist? So that's the question that's brought up. And so in order to do that, we've got to go against what Parmenides has said. And so that's kind of the next step. And so what we find out in this dialogue is that non-being is something that is either other or different than something that has being, instead of it being nothing. So now we can talk about it and we can use it in the definition of the Sophist. Again, that is a very top level what happens in this dialogue. I will get into it much more in segment 2. And then in segment 3, I'll share my one thing, the most important ramification for this argument. So as I stated at the beginning here, I had a lot of trouble with this dialogue, and I could feel my brain hurt. Like as I was reading these things, it's like my brain would short circuit. And I talked about this in my initial episode of what I'm calling the Plato Project, of reading through every dialogue of Plato. And I identified this problem I had when taking courses in college about philosophy or even reading some of these dialogues. I'm seeing it happen where I have this brain freeze where it's like my brain just shuts off. I can't understand what's going on, and I want to try to get past that. And so that's something I hope to overcome in this study of Plato and really spending time with Plato and reading the dialogues. And then I'm hoping that helps just later on, just in life in general, of not having this thing where my brain freezes to where I can keep thinking and all that. But I would really have this brain freeze phenomenon in this dialogue when it came to this idea of non-being, of something that is not. Like, how do you think about those things? And it's like my brain would just short circuit. So if I think, so that was hard for me, just thinking about things that don't exist. But then there was another thing that I found to be difficult, and in one of the introductions I read, they hit on this. And so here's the statement in that introduction. It said that this dialogue was made up of close arguments, rarely relieved by illustrations. Again, close arguments rarely relieved by illustrations. And so I found that to be the case. I was seeing that I needed to have an example of what was being discussed. So the discussion was taking place at the idea level, and it's like I just needed them to stop and say, "Hey, this is what this is like. This is in kind of a tangible example of what they're discussing," and that really does not show up very much. There's a few examples, but there's not many. So it's that I found that to be very difficult. I just needed like a break to to see like, okay, what does this mean in my daily life? Like going to the store or give me just an example that I can like touch and feel. And there just weren't many. So this dialogue came late in Plato's life, and it's often grouped with Parmenides, Philebus, Sophist, and statesman. The three versions that I read are the following. The first was the complete works, and that is in that huge red edition edited by John M. Cooper. The translator for Sophist was Nicholas P. White. And then the second version I read was from the collected dialogues, and this is the one that's edited by Edith Hamilton and Huntington Cairns. And this one was translated by Lane Cooper. And then the third one that I read was a Focus Philosophical Library edition, and the name of it is Plato, Sophist, the Professor of Wisdom. And this was translated, and then they did an introduction. So it's like three people working together, Eva Braun, Peter Kalkovage, and Eric Salem. So next I'm going to go a little bit deeper into this dialogue in segment 2. All right, well, this one is a dialogue, but it's not a Socratic dialogue. So a Socratic dialogue is often what we find with Plato, and that simply means that Socrates was one of the participants in the dialogue. He's not in this one. This is a dialogue between a visitor or stranger, depending on the translation, from Elea, and then he is in dialogue with Theaetetus. And Elea is where Parmenides is from, and I'll go into Parmenides a little bit more in this segment, but I mentioned him in the first segment, and that's the philosopher Parmenides. That's who they need to get past one of his ideas, and this is holding up the ability to define the sophist. And so the visitor from Elea has learned directly from Parmenides. And so there's just kind of an interesting aspect of the dialogue in that sense and they even talk about Parmenides being this visitor's father in a way, of a father in ideas. And so that's the idea being argued against. And so having a visitor from that area who is familiar with Parmenides kind of helps the dialogue go forward. So again, the goal here is to seek a definition of the sophist. And so we're trying to get at the essence of the sophist, to where we could easily spot a sophist out in the wild and say, there's one. And we've come across sophist in Greek tragedy and also in Greek comedy. So if you remember the Aristophanes clouds, there's this idea of a new education, and this new education is being put forth by the sophist. And the sophist is a teacher who can teach either side of an argument, irrespective of its truth. And they're usually known to charge money for their work. So there's this idea that it's perhaps not for the love of the thing itself, but it's to make a living. And so it's a lot of times it's contrasted with the philosopher. So the philosopher is the lover of wisdom, but you've got this sophist who also with the philosopher is a seeking after truth, whereas the sophist they're dabbling on truth versus things that are false. They're teaching you to be conversant in both sides of that for the sake of winning an argument. So for the sake of kind of going against truth, but to get your way, to game the system by use of your words. And so most of the time there's this negative portrayal of the sophist. And so we're trying to seek a definition of the sophist in this dialogue. But it's also kind of a three-part idea here. We're trying to get a definition of three different types of people. One is the sophist, the second is the statesman, and then the last one is the philosopher. And that's stated at the beginning of this dialogue. And so we have two existing dialogues of Plato along these lines, where we've got one called the sophist and one called the statesman. Now, I covered statesman in the previous week's episode, and then Sophist in this episode. There's not a third dialogue called the Philosopher. And so perhaps we're meant to derive the definition of the philosopher by looking at these two other people, the Sophist and the statesman, and then see, okay, that's what they are. What are they not? Perhaps that's part of the definition of the philosopher. Now, just even looking at the words themselves of sophist and philosophy, we've got soph in both of those, sophist and then philosophy. And so we're hunting here. The dialogue starts with a hunt. We're hunting for the sophist, and we want to catch the sophist. So the purpose of the hunt is to catch the sophist and to find out what it is. And this is done at the start through this idea of division. So we take a term and then we divide that term into two other terms. And then we say, okay, is the sophist like this or like the other term? And then if they're like one of the terms, then we split that term, and we keep going down that division until we ideally arrive at the sophist. And so what this is called, like if you actually diagram this out, it's called a thicket. And I'll take there in one of the introductions there was this thicket, this drawing out of the arguments into this thicket, and I'll try to take a photo of that and include that in the show notes. But you just see like how broad this is and how they're trying to go about getting the definition through this division. So the visitor, the stranger in this dialogue, is trying to find out what makes the sophist appear wise, even though the sophist is not wise. And so there's in this division, they hit on three main areas at first. And the first is getting, the second separating, and then the third imitating. Now, within imitating, there is likeness imitating, and then there's appearance imitating. And if you're likeness imitating, that means you've got this thing, and then you're creating a imitation of it that looks like it. And with appearance imitating, you're making an appearance of it, but the example that's given is like, I don't know if you've ever been to a museum where you see a statue that once used to be at the top of a church or a tall building, and you come across this statue and you're like, okay, that looks very strange. But what the artist had to do, what the sculptor had to do is to create that sculpture for viewing it from way up high. And so if you're down on the ground and you're looking at this statue, it's you have to create it in a different way. So like some features are going to be huge and others small, whereas if you're just looking at it straight on, it looks very strange. And so there's this appearance imitating versus likeness. And so appearance, it's taking the form of it, but it's transforming it as well. And so in this idea of imitating, in talking about the sophist being one who imitates, the existence of an imitation means that non-being is. And so you have the thing that is being, you have say you're creating a painting of something or a sculpture, you're basing that. So if it's a sculpture of a person, there's the person that is, and that person is being, is a human being, and you're taking a sculpture of that. It's an imitation, but that imitation means that non-being is. And this is where we hit that snag I talked about in the first segment. Parmenides says you cannot discuss that thing that is not. You cannot discuss the non-being. And so this is the quote from Parmenides, and this is contained in the dialogue. They're referencing what Parmenides says. This should not ever prevail in your thought, that the things that are not are. Rather, do you keep your mind well shut off from just this way of searching? End quote. So basically, don't even think about or talk about things that don't exist. But here's the ramifications. If non-being is not even thinkable and ought not to be uttered, then there is no false, and everything a person says is true. Let me say that again. If non-being is not even thinkable and ought not to be uttered, then there is no false, and everything a person says is true. What that means is that then everything is relative. So as one of the introductions says, Plato is demolishing a widespread notion that a false statement is impossible. So now to define the sophist, we need to figure out a way to say that something that is not is. And so this would also mean that the stranger or the visitor in this dialogue, he's going to have to go against his teacher, Parmenides. And so here's the revised goal, and this shows up after this, or this shows up in about the middle of the dialogue. So he says, let's see whether it's in some way permissible for us to say the following and come off unpunished, that non-being is, even though in its very being it is not. End quote. So then we get into a discussion about forms and kinds. And kinds here are universal forms that all other forms must involve. And so I'm going to kind of read different parts of this section, but we start off with three kinds. And again, these kinds, they must show up in the forms. And so let me start reading here. This is in section 254 and comes right after that part I just read. So surely the greatest of the kinds are those we are going through just now, being itself and rest in motion. And Theaetetus responds by far the greatest. And then the stranger says, moreover, we affirm that the members of one pair of them are unmixable with one another. But being is mixable with both, for us, I suppose both are. And I'm taking myself out of the quote here. So what that means is you've got being, and then you've got being that is either at rest or is in motion. So you've got being that is, or and that's the one that's at rest, or you've got being that's in motion, so it's becoming. So either is or becoming. So you've got three different kinds here: being, rest, and motion. But they cannot, those two that are connected, so like being with rest cannot be the same as being with motion, because one is and then the other is becoming. And so you've got to introduce two more terms. And so here's what the stranger says. Then each of them is other than the remaining pair, but itself the same as itself. And I'll stop reading there. So with being, with rest and motion, then they can either be the same. So being and rest would be the same, or being and motion is the same. But is and becoming cannot be the same. So they either have to be different or other. And so we've got two more terms now. We've got the same or other. So we've got five terms or five kinds in total: being, rest, motion, same, and other. And they use that to say that the other is non-being. And so if we're looking at this as forms, the way that you can talk about non-being is by saying that it is the other, or it is different from being. So here's what one of the introductions says about that. Non-being interpreted as the other thus ceases to be mere nothingness and becomes instead the source of articulated diversity in things and in thought. Parmenides has been superseded, end quote. So at the end, the Sophist makes, this is what we come to understand about the Sophist. The Sophist makes images or imitations of what he does not know. He creates false appearances. And so he is not a philosopher, he's not a lover of wisdom, but he's a false image of a wise man. And so what the stranger has to do is show that Parmenides was wrong, and that is it is possible to say and to think things that are not as though they are. So did you get that? I know it's complex. I had a lot of trouble with this one. But in conversations with Dr. Jason Staples, it really helped me to think about this. And he talked about it in this way, that as English speakers, we have a hard time with this idea of being or becoming. So if something is or is becoming, because we have one term for this idea, and that's the verb to be. In being, and then the verb form of to be. But in Spanish, I took Spanish class, and we always had these two different versions of that word. We had ser, and then we had a star. So ser was like, yo soy Eric. That's the form of the verb, I am Eric. That's not changing. My name will be the same. And so ser is kind of the domain of forms or essence and the things that are fixed. It is the part of to be that is. But then a star, that's more about motion or location, like I am here, I am in this place. And so a star is talking about the domain of change, and that's more of is becoming. So you've got ser, which is more of the is, and then you've got a star, which is more of is becoming. And that was very helpful for me just in thinking about these terms and just thinking about being, non-being, and everything in between. I want to read one part in this dialogue that I really appreciated, and then I'll say why I appreciate it. And this comes right at the beginning. It's actually like on the third page of the dialogue, and it's the stranger or visitor speaking here. At present, you see, all that you and I possess in common is the name. The thing to which each of us gives that name we may perhaps have privately before our minds, but it is always desirable to have reached an agreement about the thing itself by means of explicit statements, rather than be content to use the same word without formulating what it means. End quote. I love that. So at the beginning, they're talking about the name of the Sophist. And so they both probably have an idea of what the Sophist is in their heads. And before they get started, they need to find out what that is. What do each of them think? And I've been thinking about this a lot, but just even like for political debates, how wonderful would it be that if any kind of big word term was introduced by either of the participants, they had to stop the discussion, they had to stop the debate, and each person had to give a one-sentence definition for that term, just to see, okay, are we even talking about the same thing here? And I think that would be so helpful in discussions and our dialogue. But I love that this particular dialogue starts off with that. Let's determine what this word means so that we're sure that we're talking about the same thing. That our online discussions, our in-person debates, if they all started that way. So next I'm going to get into segment 3 and the one thing, my most important takeaway from this dialogue, Sophist by Plato. Well, in this dialogue, there's a lot about forms. And so when I'm thinking about my one thing, I want to tie it to the idea of forms. And so being and non-being, how does that all relate to Plato's ideas of forms? And so I thought what would be the most helpful is just to share some of the questions that I had written down as I was thinking through the Sophist. And here's the main question that I had. If something is false, does it have a form? And is that somehow tied to Parmenides' thought process where he's saying there's just the one thing, there's just being, you can't even discuss non-being? Is part of that just the idea that if you discuss non-being, you introduce that it has to have a form attached to it? In my deeper question there is, if non-being has a form, and we're thinking about non-being as something that is false, would that just implode the system? Would everything just break down? Because now you have forms that are both true and false. Where's the objective truth in that? So that's the question I had. In my thought process here being non-being or something that is false cannot have a form, because forms by definition must be true. Otherwise, there'd be no objective standard, and true and false forms would be battling against each other in pure chaos. So if non-being or untrue things cannot have a form, they must be other than a form. So tying it to forms really helped me to understand the purpose of this dialogue. It's really a takedown of Parmenides. If false doesn't have a form, then everything everyone says is true, which it can't be. That's chaos. But if false is merely other or a different thing than a form, there exists an objective standard by which to judge something other than the form. That's a really important concept in thinking about Plato's forms. There cannot be false forms. That's my one thing, and it's the idea that I hope to explore further in his other dialogues. So in conclusion, this is quite a sophisticated dialogue, and I think it's funny. I thought about that word sophisticated when I was reading this dialogue, because the very first part of that word is sophist. And so I looked at the history of that word, and it did start off with more of a negative connotation. Someone who was sophisticated had the more of the connotation of the sophist, and now we have sophisticated. We think of that person we put that person in high regard. So it's kind of an interesting thing. But you just see how many words of ours have soph and sophist within the word. It's interesting to think about that thing. If I rambled, if I missed things, please let me know. My desire here is to learn, as evidenced by reading it 3 times, really trying to dig deep into this one and not moving forward until I had at least a better understanding than just, reading through it and missing everything. So if you've noticed something that I've missed or you want to share something, please leave a comment on Substack, because then other people can see it, they can respond to it. We can get a discussion going. This one was so hard for me, but I'm glad I stuck with it and I battled it out. I read Parmenides after this one. In Parmenides, that dialogue by Plato is even more difficult than Sophist, and it actually helped me realize some things about Sophist and just helped me in understanding Sophist. So if you really want your brain to be fried, read Parmenides. And I don't know if I will be covering that one on the podcast, just because I don't think I grasped it very well, and it is so hard, but it did have the benefit of helping me to understand some things about Sophist. So in terms of what's next on the reading schedule, I'm currently reading a work by Dostoevsky. Actually, it's 3 works. It's 3 short stories of his, but it's contained in this book called White Knights. And I'm leading a reading group about White Knights next week. And I'd love for you to join. You can just become a paid subscriber on Substack, and I'll send you the Zoom link for that. We'll be meeting next Wednesday, November 12th, for that discussion. But this has been a nice break from Plato. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes I just need examples, or I was just thinking, I need some fiction in my life right now just to break this philosophy, these dialogues. And so preparing for this reading group has been a welcome break from Plato. After White Knights, I should finish that in the next couple days. After that, I'm going to read a book about Plato by Robin Waterfield, and it's called Plato of Athens. And I've had this one recommended to me. So, I've read 9 dialogues now, and I want to know a little bit more about Plato, and then I'll go back into the Plato project, and my next dialogue is Philebus. Then in December, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do yet. I may continue on with the Plato project. Usually I take December I call it my winter break, and I just read books that have kind of piled up on the to be read pile. But I took kind of one of those months earlier this year, a break month. And so I may just kind of keep going with Plato and maybe read 1 or 2 books that are on that to be read pile. So we'll see how it goes, but still thinking that through. All right, that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at eric@booksoftitans.com. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter. The website is full of a ton of different resources to help you find books and create your own reading list. I'll be back next week to discuss another dialogue by Plato, or perhaps this Dostoevsky short work series that I'm reading right now. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.